the revolution, because that is both Kentucky's origin story and also the nation's revolution. And 1775, I put a little timer here, so I'll keep myself on. 1775 kicks off the revolution and kicks off white settlement in Kentucky. Harrodsburg and Boonesboro, the first two settlements established that year. And people soon running mad for Kentucky. Now, we usually think of, when we're thinking about the revolution, the taxes that Americans, the colonists, were pushing back against, but the proclamation of 1763, a key factor, people upset that land wasn't available to them. Lexington, of course, here in Kentucky, a tribute to the first shots of the revolution. Living in the backcountry during the revolution, going to be extremely challenging. Most Westerners are going to be patriots, although some Tories are also moving west. Kentucky starts out a county of Virginia. Hopefully you knew that, but will mostly be neglected. Citizens taking it upon themselves to form militias, names that we know, Daniel Boone, most famously, but also George Rogers Clark, Simon Kenton, some of the early heroes of the frontier. Clashes between natives and white settlers, we could say, were probably bound to happen, but the revolution going to make these relationships more tense. The British, recognizing the value of forcing colonists to fight on two fronts, and so they open up a Western theater and encourage the Indians to go and attack the Kentucky settlements. Very famously, the British Lieutenant Governor Harry Hamilton, Harry of all names, supposedly buying scalps of white settlers. George Rogers Clark going to lead the Northwest campaign, trying to dislodge the British from those forts. The revolution ends in 1781, but it's not going to end for Kentuckians, because the violence is going to go on. And in fact, some of the bloodiest years will be in 1782. I almost made it in 2 minutes. And that may all be a blur, but one thing you need to know is that Kentucky is being settled as the nation is being founded. That's really, really important to our story. Kentuckians managed to hold on during the Revolution. And now at that point, with the bid for independence over, the real work began. Americans looking to fulfill the promises of the revolution. Now, I want you to stop and think, and really encourage your students to stop and think. We say these words all the time: liberty, democracy, equality, the ideals that America was founded on. And for us, this has always been the way things are. This is as natural to us as breathing. But we've got to remind ourselves and our students how earth-shattering this was. A revolution against monarchy, a revolution that pointed toward social mobility. This was truly revolutionary for the people who were living through it. But the military victory, only the first step, because like I said, the real work now beginning. We had to make democracy work. We had to create government structures to embed these ideals into a new way of life. And the big question for Americans, going to be the big question for Kentuckians, is how will government be done? And we've got to remember too that this was a really risky experiment. We know how the story turns out. We know this is going to be great. The world is going to embrace this. But people living at the time certainly do not know what's to come. And so a risky experiment. The word democracy had pejorative overtones at some points. It's certainly in some people's minds. The risk of disorder, government by the unfit, the mob ruling. These were concerns that Americans had coming out of the revolution. And so that as the backdrop, this question of how government will be done, and remembering that this is a big experiment and no one knows if it's going to work or not. Now, very quick reminder, of course, before we get to Kentucky government, I always remind my students of this in case they've forgotten some of their general US history, that we have a national government that's taking shape in the wake of the revolution, and some false starts, misstarts, you could say. And I know you all are familiar with government that forms during the revolution, the Continental Congress. We needed some unity to facilitate this rebellion. And so the Continental Congress, acting as a very loose association, a weak decentralized government for sure. And that continuing with the Articles of Confederation, which Americans are living under from 1781 to 1789. And I'm sure you know what some of the problems with the Articles were. The US really not a united nation, more like 13 separate countries who are agreeing to work together, but very decentralized. And to a certain extent, the US, the joke of the world, people wondering how we could have possibly made this work when Congress couldn't raise an army, couldn't collect taxes. So some concerns with the Articles of Confederation, which then will lead to the ratification of the US Constitution. We had to scrap the Articles, start fresh. We do that, and this Constitution, what governs us today. It's amendable, and we have amended it, and it has grown with us as a nation. So that's the national backdrop, of course. Now, the new nation, the new federal government, going to have to deal with a multitude of issues. One big one, and one that certainly has ramifications for our story, is the question of expansion and what to do with Western lands. People were asking, again, here, we know how the story turns out. They don't know at this time. Will we just be 13 states and that's it? Or will the US extend beyond that? Now, the idea of expanding into new areas is going to bring some challenges, some possibilities, but also challenges. One is you have the geographic problem. You have the Appalachian Mountains acting as something bigger, separating east from west. There's only a few crossover points across the mountains. And so this an effective challenge. You have the question of Native Americans. And Spanish support. They are going to some real defeats and some blows, and certainly cause a lot of problems for individual Kentucky settlers. You have the tenuous loyalties of people living in the West. British and colonial governments had largely ignored Western settlement during the war. You have ambitious men like Richard Henderson and other kind of ne'er-do-wells, certainly conniving individuals who are looking to capitalize. They're looking to profit individually. Aaron Burr, John Wilkinson, some of the other names. Many people had moved to the West precisely for the reason that they want to escape government. And so they're going to be a little unruly, a little hard to gather and unify. US government, though, looking to turn what was currently wilderness into land, real estate, making it part of a commercial empire and a commercial economy. So this is going to be challenging, this question of adding to the West. Then you add in the fact that certain colonies were considered landed colonies. Virginia, when it was formed, had this wide swath that reached to the West. Land really, as far as people could imagine, it would all fell under the orbit and the control of Virginia. So these landed colonies and the unlanded colonies, this is going to require some compromise between the existing states to be willing to see new states carved out of their Western lands. Some of the new government, the new federal government's first moves, though, involve what to do with the West. A series of land ordinances, policymaking that's going on in the 1780s. Here you see a map of the Northwest Territory. Ohio and states above the Ohio River in this western area going to have very different experience than Kentucky had in its founding and frontier period. Kentucky settled really haphazardly because it was ignored. It was not a priority for Virginia or for a long time. But this area, Northwest Territory, is going to be different. It will be officially surveyed. It will be established according to a grid system. A lot more order and thought go into this region's organization. Created townships that were 6 miles square, and further subdivided then into 36 1-mile square sections. Now, right from the start, a provision for education in these regions. So a certain number of 4 sections of each of those townships set aside to support a public school. The Northwest Ordinance outlined the process for statehood, how that would happen, and an expectation that 6 new states would be created, but they would go through a very regimented process. So once you had 5,000 settlers living in a place, you could petition to establish a legislature. And then once you had 60,000 people, you could apply for statehood. So this expected how it will happen. Slavery So it will not be a question that needs answered. It was answered. Now, above the Ohio River. So you can see here the grid system, the plan to support public education, process for statehood, and prohibiting slavery makes these Northwest states much different. North of the Ohio, Kentucky below the Ohio River, left to figure things out. And Kentucky's going to look very different because of this than places far north. And you can see here the linear, maybe you've gone to states before where they have townships and you think, oh, well, Kentucky, we have our counties, this very different. They're in map of a patchwork. Counties, that makes us different than other places, and certainly not linear as you see there. It can also explain a lot of other things. Paltry support for education in Kentucky's early years. It explains why we have a greater disparity of wealth. In the Northwest Ordinance areas, it was rare to own more than 640 acres. It's also going to explain something about our relationship with slavery. So Kentucky, like I said, becoming a state, more chaotic, figured it out as A long but very peaceful process. And Kentuckians knew right away that this was the goal, that this was as early as the late 1770s. People in Kentucky were talking about becoming an independent state, to break away from Virginia and be a state in the Union. Now, at this point, Kentucky had barely become a county of Virginia, but this was what they're anticipating. But the late 1770s, not an ideal time to embark on this journey. Both Virginia and the new national government that's taking shape, they're saddled with other problems. You're also going to run into things like problems with quorum over the next decade or so, when Kentuckians are working towards statehood. The District of Kentucky, Virginia, and the federal government all have to agree on the terms to create Kentucky as an independent state, and that's going to pose some problems. For a time, there's also going to be talk that Kentucky might not become part of the new United States at all, that we might ally with the Spanish. So this process, it's not predetermined that we will become a state in the Union. Now, we could ask, why do Kentuckians like this idea of becoming independent from Virginia? Well, there's a couple things going on that were propelling them in this direction. One is Native American attacks and the need to protect themselves. Throughout the 1780s into the 19th century, this threat of Indian attack is going to continue. Virginia, national figures, they don't pay as much mind to the daily terrors that white Kentuckians are experiencing. The expectation was that Kentuckians could defend themselves if attacked, but that left them as sitting ducks the way they saw it. They had to have permission from Virginia to go on the offensive. And so this very frustrating to them. Now, another concern, another reason why they want to become an independent state is their distance from Virginia. 1780, Kentucky was divided into 3 counties. And here you can see a map. We had originally been a singular county. Now Fayette, Lincoln, Jefferson carved out. That made local government more close, or it made it closer for local government functions, but anything that happened on the state level, very far away. A trip to Richmond, Virginia, that's no easy thing. And you're having to go there if you want to register land claims or appeal a court decision. If you're representing one of these counties in the legislature, that's a long trip back. It also made it hard for Kentuckians to hear about new laws because the Postal Service hadn't been extended. So the way Kentuckians saw it, they were paying equal taxes, but they were not getting the same services. You know, that whole cry, no taxation without representation. I mean, this is kind of ringing in their ears. And so they see this as a big problem. And the fact that 3 counties, even if they have 2 representatives each, that is a very small voice that Kentucky has compared to all of the Easterners back in Virginia, where there are multiple counties with multiple representatives. And the way Kentuckians saw it, their interests very different from those of the vast majority of Virginians. They had different needs. They needed more say. So inadequate representation, another factor. Here you can see by 1792, we had 6 additional counties, but still that's 9. It's not enough the way Kentuckians see it. And let me just point out, this map is really interesting. You would have thought it would be easier to find a map, a county map of Kentucky in 1792, but this is the one I found, and someone has identified there where Jerry lives. and written on it, but I don't know who Jerry is. Hard to find a county map, though. Now, one other huge gripe that Kentuckians have, and I've alluded to it when I talked about the Spanish, and that's access to the Mississippi River. The way Kentuckians saw it was key to the West. If they were going to be economically successful in the West, they needed a method to get products to market, and the Mississippi River was it. But the Mississippi River, a problem because the Spanish had a stranglehold on trade going down that river. After the French and Indian War, as part of the peace settlement, Britain and Spain had used the Mississippi River as the dividing line. Now the United States has become is sitting on the eastern side of that river, but the Spanish still sharing it with them. And importantly, the Spanish control the port of New Orleans. So any goods that are going down the river have to be processed by the Spanish. And that's creating all kinds of problems for Kentucky in the 1780s. Kentuckians looked to the Confederation Congress to do something about this, to address the need to have better access to the river. And American officials bargained this away. In Jay's Treaty, they gave up, they were about to give up, I should say. They were about to give up access to the river for 25 years in exchange for policies that would have benefited those living in the East. And Kentuckians are fit to be tied about this. And so that's when they start thinking about, maybe we don't even need to become a state of the United States. Maybe we should become part of the Spanish Empire. And some Kentuckians, very influential Kentuckians, are going to try and lead us in that direction. But another reason why Kentuckians are saying we need to be separate from Virginia. Finally, this a big issue, especially for Kentuckians who are risking so much and weren't able to claim land, and that is a lot of Kentuckians. They're unhappy with how Virginia is conducting the process of distributing land. Now, I said the Northwest Ordinance is going to make sure there's official surveys, and this all goes just so. None of that had happened with Kentucky. The land claim process was chaotic, it was frustrating, it was changing all the time. People would turn around and things were different. And many were finding themselves having taken this risk to come west and end up with nothing. The land being gobbled up by speculators, and just a few people holding massive tracts of some of the best land. So Kentuckians hoping that independence from Virginia is going to solve a multitude of problems that they're facing. Now, I should have asked you this date. I always tell my students, if there's one date you remember about Kentucky history, we should all know this one, and most seem to. But 1792, actually April of 1791, after 10 statehood conventions, after years of negotiation, Kentucky's request to become an independent state was approved. That meant in June of 1792, Kentucky would officially enter the Union as the 15th state, the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And students often ask me about that term, Commonwealth. It's largely semantics. Only 4 states are officially known as Commonwealths. And if you know what those states are, you can put that in chat. A Commonwealth does, though, suggest something about the general welfare. Anyone know any of the other Commonwealths? One of them makes a whole lot of sense if we're talking about how Kentucky came to be and some of our earlier ties. Let's see. Oh, now we're getting Virginia. Yeah. Born out of Virginia. Virginia's Commonwealth. We will be as well. Pennsylvania. Good. We also have Massachusetts is the other Commonwealth. So largely semantics, but I think there is something about being able to say we are invested in the general welfare. Commonwealth of Kentucky has a nice ring. So Kentucky going to enter the United States as an independent state in June of 1792. But first, we can't do that if we don't have a government. We've got to write a constitution. And this is no small task. For one thing, Kentucky at a disadvantage because we had never had a period of self-government. We had always been part of Virginia. Only one other state in a similar boat, Maine, hadn't had a time period of self-government either. Kentucky, a place where there's a lot of competing interests. You have class interests. We're going to see how that goes into shaping our Constitution. Geographical interests. There had been two main routes into Kentucky. One was down the Ohio River and one up through the Cumberland Gap. But that meant that Kentuckians were coming from very different places, from north and south. They were coming with different ideas about things like slavery. And because we'd never had a period of self-government, we hadn't been able to smooth out some of these differences. So that's all going to come up as we're trying to create a framework of government, whose interests are going to win out. Kentuckians themselves skeptical about their ability to write a constitution. Other people in other places of the country throwing on to us too, saying, oh, they're not going to be able to do this. If they do write a constitution, it's going to be some radical out there cockamamie document. They tended to look at people living in the West as a little uncivilized, and so skeptical about Kentuckians' ability to frame a government. But Kentuckians themselves, they tried to get James Madison to write their constitution for them. Madison rightly said, nope, you gotta just do this. Buckle down, you can write a constitution. But so many people looking at Kentucky to see what happens here, because this is where we're learning if democracy is going to work. I said a guinea pig, a testing ground. Constitutional Convention meeting in Danville, 1792, that spring. It's an 18-day convention, and they're going to produce a 17-page document. The main players, well, not a lot of names that had been well known in Kentucky's early founding. You don't have Boone, he's moved on. Herod, Clark, Simon Kenton, none of them are going to be part of state making. Most of the people involved will be newcomers to the state. They tend to be wealthier, tended to be a little more established, but collectively they have very little political experience, especially when you compare us to Virginia, where some of the intellectual powerhouses of the nation are. Kentucky doesn't have any of that storehouse of knowledge. Now, the big exception, a man named George Nicholas, known as the father of Kentucky's Constitution. He's from Virginia. He was a lawyer. He had been part of the process of ratifying the US Constitution. So he has some experience. He's not a great legal mind, but we can say he was competent. And he really stands out for his competence because so many people were utter novices in this process. Now, though most Kentuckians had little experience in governing, one thing to be said about them is they are extremely interested in the process. Just common Joe off the street, really concerned about constitution making, and debate is going to explode across Kentucky. Students are always really, I think, surprised at this, how involved and interested Kentuckians were. I mean, some of these people are illiterate, but they really want to know what's going on and to have a voice. Democratic clubs, every community seem to have a Democratic club. They're meeting several times a week for hours to debate and discuss. The newspaper is filled with debate about the Constitution. So much riding on this process for so many people. And what we're going to see is three factions developing. These aren't political parties per se, but like-minded individuals who are allying to have a voice to help shape the Constitution. And so in this group, or one of these three factions, we have planters, we have partisans, and we have the court party. Now, planters, also sometimes known as the country party, these are what it sounds like. They're connected to plantations, large landholders, not the workforce, but the owners of these operations. So I always imagine people that are probably not getting their own hands very dirty, but making a living off of big agriculture. This is the bluegrass elite, the who's who of some of Virginia's most prominent families. You have Bullets and the Breckenridges and the McDowells, for instance, owners of very good soil. That's what attracted them to this place. They tended to be large landowners and also enslavers. And they want to create a system that benefits people like them. They believed in natural aristocracy, that some people were destined to lead and others to follow, to be led. Politics of deference. They are invested in a social hierarchy and with themselves at the top. They want the wealthy and powerful to provide leadership. And they want a constitution with lots of checks and balances because they're really afraid of the rabble getting too much of a voice. They want a constitution that's going to protect private property above all else, because they say that's going to attract the right kind of settlers. Now, the partisans, if we're thinking about partisan politics, they think very differently than the planters. They were landless men who had come to Kentucky with a dream of something more. They're up-and-comers. They're second and third sons who are coming from little, hoping to gain something. Not as influential as the other two factions, the partisans. They're hoping to start over. Now, they had come earlier than the planters in most cases, but had been disappointed by Kentucky's chaotic land policies. They want a democratic system, a more egalitarian system with more possibility for social mobility. And they want to be leaders in this new place, not the highfalutin aristocrats. They believe that virtue and common sense are the way to get things done. That's more important than wealth and other factors that are often used for choosing leaders. So they want to see themselves in positions of authority so they can bring their good old common sense to it. They're promoting land redistribution. That's one of their biggest issues, especially absentee speculators. They say, hey, we should just throw it all out and start fresh. Now that Kentucky is becoming its own state, let's just toss those claims out and start handing out land fresh and new. And so this is one of the big things that they're going to really debate and cry out for in the newspapers. Now, what's always interesting to students, the partisans, not anti-slavery. Students always expect that's the case, that, oh, the planters are for slavery, partisans opposite. No, because they're hoping for something more. They see themselves as slaveholders in the future. And so that's a really interesting thing about the partisans and some of these divides. The other group coming together, the court party. So those are the legal types, lawyers, judges. They share with the planters certain things. They have a more Republican vision for Kentucky. So they see themselves as the leaders representing those below them. They want opportunity to participate in local government. They've been drawn to the state for the reason that they can hopefully make money as lawyers settling some of the land claims. Not as enthusiastically welcomed. And in fact, the Constitution of Kentucky almost prevented them from office holding. So, we make our lawyer jokes today. People are making their lawyer jokes in the 1790s. One thing the court party wants, they also want land reform because they got here late. They are hoping to shake things up a little as far as who holds the land. So this Constitution, shaped by factions, but marked by compromise. These fears that the frontier is going to produce a radical document were unfounded. And really, Kentucky's Constitution going to look very similar to that found in other places. We're going to use states like Pennsylvania as our model, and we can see that influence. So some basics, 3 branches of government, standard stuff. You have a powerful executive. That makes us a little different than some other places, though. 3 branches of government, I should say. The legislative branch, there was a lot of debate over this. 2 houses, a bicameral legislature, to use the fancy term. Some people, the planters said, we just need 1 house. You don't need, or no, it was the partisans who wanted just 1 house. That would be most efficient. It would not cost as much. The planters want a check on the rabble. They want those checks and balances. So some debate over that, but they do decide on a bicameral legislature. Powerful executive. Kentucky governor going to hold a longer term of office. We'd learned from some other states their mistakes. In some cases, they were only letting the governor serve 1 or 2 years. Here we say 4 years. And at first, the governor can succeed themselves. They can hold back-to-back terms. That's going to change very quickly, but at first it was that way. You have no land reform. So the court party, the partisans who are hoping for that, we don't throw it all out and start anew. But some other victories for democracy. One is voting rights. Kentucky going to take a different path than Virginia. Say, Virginia, if you lived there, to vote, you had to be a landowner. You had to own 25 acres of land with a house or 50 acres of unimproved land. Kentucky, you don't have to own a square inch of land. You just had to be male. You had to be over the age of 21, and you had to live in Kentucky for 2 years. Those were the only requirements for voting. And this was good because in 1792, as many as 2/3 of Kentucky's white adult males did not own any property. So we would have really limited the voice of democracy had we said you have to own land. Now, the most contentious issue of our Constitution by far is the slavery question. And it's going to be decided with an article of our Confederation or our Constitution, Article 9. By this point, northern states had started to abolish slavery. We said that Vermont had come in right before Kentucky does to the Union, and it came in as an emancipated state. It was illegal to own slaves in Vermont. So everyone looking to Kentucky, what path would we take? And we really could have set a precedent. We could have really, I think, turned a tide here. Slaves had been in Kentucky from day one. They'd been needed on the frontier. In 1790, there were about 12,000 slaves, enslaved people living in Kentucky, about 16% of the population, so not a small amount. But some Kentuckians, abolitionists, arguing that if Kentucky was going to shed its ties to slavery, this was the moment to do so. Opponents argued that Kentucky, if it was going to be a true democracy, we had to abolish slavery. There was a fear that slavery would make white men idle and vice would spread. The most vocal opponents to allowing slavery in Kentucky were ministers, and they're using biblical positions to support this. David Rice, a minister, very famously urging that Kentucky not be born into sin. That's how he described it. But abolitionists not successful, and Article 9 will pass, although the vote will be very close. It'll be 26 to 16. So this was not a foregone conclusion that Kentucky would go this direction. But slaves in Virginia now would be slaves in Kentucky. All 7 ministers voted against slavery. And there we did actually insert a clause into the Constitution prohibiting clergy. They couldn't serve in the state legislature. So we want to make sure they don't do this again down the line. Now, what's interesting, this Constitution not as stringent as our subsequent constitutions, especially about that issue of slavery. So one thing you could do under this first Constitution, if enslavers wanted to free their slaves, they could do that at their own expense. Later, there's going to be stipulations that prohibit them from doing so. Free Blacks could vote in these earliest years of Kentucky history. I find this really fascinating. And for a while, I didn't quite understand. I thought there had just been a mistake. Like this seemed going too far, even for a new state. And I know, the Revolution had been fought for lofty principles, but it seemed like racism was strong enough that was surprising to me. But it was actually the case that in these earliest years after the Revolution, several states do things that are surprising to expand democracy. In New Jersey, they allow women to vote for a short period of time. Here in Kentucky, free Blacks allowed to vote. Now, the further we move from the Revolution, that fervor kind of dies away. And when we rewrite our Constitution in 1799, we will state that Black men cannot vote. We'll make race an additional requirement of voting. Cannot amend our first Constitution. That's why we have to rewrite it just a few years later, 1799. We will take another stab at it. I'll go just real quickly say something about our first governor. Our Constitution's approved in April. We're going to enter the Union in June, so we have to decide on these things very quickly. Isaac Shelby, our first governor. Yeah, the best thing we can say about him is he has sound character, good sense of direction, wide support. He's kind of like George Washington that way. He doesn't have a lot of enemies. Selecting a capital, that isn't going to happen before Kentucky becomes a state. And our first legislative session will actually be held in a log cabin in Lexington. Later on, Frankfort chosen, really interesting story. Basically, they gave the best promises of the most financial support. They kind of buy the capital. It's sort of like when the Olympics are considering bids for where the Olympics will be held. That's similar to Frankfurt being chosen. And so Frankfurt will be the winner there. State symbols. Let me just show you. These are interesting to look at. You've probably, and if you teach elementary school, I bet you do things with some of these, some of them to be expected, like state mineral, coal, maybe you know the state flower, goldenrod, but did you know the state drink is milk? Now, good Kentuckians, we question that decision. And so maybe it should be a couple of years ago. It did not go through, but someone will bring that up again, I'm sure, at some point. So let me just end by saying, if we're thinking about the government Kentucky created and assessing Kentucky's first constitution, I think it's really interesting to end with our state seal. And maybe you're saying, I don't recognize that state seal there. We're going to change it, and it's undergone a number of revisions, but that one there with the two men embracing, an interesting take on, and that our first constitution, this is what it looks like today, or our first seal, I should say. And we have there what looks like a frontiersman and what looks like maybe more of an aristocrat. And this idea of a commonwealth, united we stand, divided we fall, suggesting the diversity, economic diversity of Kentucky, the regional diversity, bringing people together. And Kentuckians have liked to say from its earliest days that this was destined to be a good poor man's country. The partisans hoped that. That's what lured them to Kentucky, this idea of creating a place that was more egalitarian. So the question is, did Kentucky succeed in that? Well, we don't wipe out class distinctions. We certainly don't wipe out race distinctions. But that wasn't what these early framers were trying to create. They are not creating a society of equals. In many ways, Kentucky is going to be Virginia made over. But we were trying to improve upon government. We were trying to improve on things that stood in the way of individual achievement, the whole idea of equality of opportunity versus true equality. Kentucky seemed to offer at least more chance, that equality of opportunity. But of course, if you're not white and not male, this Constitution certainly not providing any kind of true equality. And what's going to happen in Kentucky is a lot of people who had come seeking this good poor man's country, they're going to continue moving west. The grass is always greener. They're looking for new frontiers beyond Kentucky. So okay, we actually have a couple of minutes. I threw out this question at one time, then I did one of these, and we can think about this as we're wrapping up, or I can just, take questions if you want, but how you use this material in your own classes. I think, now's the time when it's fresh on your mind, maybe to strategize how this can be useful to you in your classes. So if anyone wants to throw out ideas there, I think that would be a good use of our time. Or like I said, I can take questions too. Or we can just knock off early and say the thrills of the Constitution, we just really absorbed it all. And, now we can call it a day. Anyone have any ideas, things you want to do with this material, or things that you already do where this can intersect with those topics.
I think for me, it was just a good reminder to always be thinking like a historian. Even from the beginning, when you said, you know, these are concepts and ideas that are so common to us because that's how it's always been.
Mhm.
But as the country was being built, it was all foreign and on so many levels, the complete opposite of what they, were accustomed to. So
Yeah.
I think anytime that we have a session like this and we're just reminded that to look through the eyes of the people who were living it and try to get our students to look from that point of view also.
Yeah. Yeah, and take off our glasses that we wear as citizens of the 21st century, and to put yourself back in a time and place where you don't know how it's going to turn out. And this is truly revolutionary. So Beth, thanks. Yeah, that's great. Anytime that you can remind students of that and give them examples where they can see, oh, okay, yeah, this, I can't think like I do today. I need to understand it from the perspective of people from past generation.
I really like too how we can draw a connection to our unbridled spirit, Kentucky or whatever, and go back and say, when we were thinking about statehood, we had the same issues of no taxation without representation type stuff that was going on, that ended up making our country. And I think it's just a good tie-in for those students to how we got to where we are today too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think anytime you can bring it close to home and they see this as their story, having that Kentucky connection really helps in that regard. And so Kentucky being established right alongside this new nation, that is a real convenient way to think about that story in a very personal way.
I think also it was really neat because I didn't realize, we almost went to the Spanish side there. I think that would be really neat and could bring in some really interesting conversations as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, can you imagine what would have happened? This whole story did not have to turn out the way it did. All these contingencies. Oh, the milk store. Yeah. 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 Well, and people petitioning to get that changed, and the voice of democracy strong on behalf of bourbon. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Well, I'll stay on here for a few minutes if anyone has any questions or anything you want to discuss. But thank you for being here. I appreciate it. And I always enjoy being with you all. And so thanks for sharing your afternoon with me.
Thank you so very much. And like Dr. Goan said, thank you all so much for spending another afternoon with us. We love this. I always walk away with so much information. I'm like, you all had no idea about the milk. And I think what Damien said too, in fifth grade, kids are so interested about how Kentucky played a role in American history. As a former fifth grade teacher, I second that absolutely. And I think just in all of our grades, now knowing, and Dr. Goan and I had this conversation, knowing that pivotal role that, that each grade level now has in incorporating Kentucky history and Kentucky economics and Kentucky government. I think knowing this and kind of versing ourselves in this too, it kind of helps to have that background to say, hey, did you know? Or just to kind of making yourselves a little bit more of an expert about Kentucky. It just kind of helps you to feel more qualified when they ask these questions, like, oh, let me give you a little bit more information about that. So I think just building our own knowledge base and about Kentucky and getting, again, it all goes back to inquiry. If we can pique their interest and letting them dig and letting them find out more information. I used to love it when they would say, hey, I went home and I found this out. Did you know? That's what we're wanting. We're wanting to spark that, where students go and they find information and they come back and tell us about it. So thank you all so much. I can't wait to see how you're going to create your own little inquiry investigations with your students this week, or as you know, your units are building. Very, very wonderful, interesting facts. I love seeing your comments. This is going to be great. And thanks as always, Dr. Goan. These are wonderful sessions. You're making us all feel, you're equipping us with knowledge, and I love it. So you all, if you have any questions for me, I know I've been sending out lots of information about charge, about teacher post-tests, student post-tests, anything like that that you all need questions about, just feel free to, I'll stay on here as well and ask and try to answer any questions that I can. But thank you all. You have a wonderful evening.